He didn't look like a man capable of what they said he'd done. When the bailiff read the charges, Ethan Rowe stood there quietly, hands clasped in front of him, his face calm and unreadable. No tears. No anger. Just that same faint, restrained smile. In a courtroom filled with tension, that smile was more terrifying than any confession. To the people of Millhaven, Indiana, it was the final insult, the calm expression of a man who'd taken 3 lives without remorse. But to those who knew him, the smile didn't fit the man they remembered. Ethan Rowe had lived in Millhaven all his life. He was 35, single, a maintenance worker at the local high school. He was known as reliable, maybe too quiet, but never unkind. He showed up early, stayed late, fixed whatever needed fixing, and spoke to almost no one. His colleagues often said you could pass Ethan in a hallway 100 times and never remember the sound of his voice. He was that kind of man, a background figure in other people's lives. Until the morning of October 9th, when the town woke to news that would burn his name into its history forever. That morning, just after dawn, a neighbor reported smoke coming from a property on the east side of town, a rundown 2-story house that had been empty for years. Fire crews responded within minutes, but what they found inside would later be described as methodical and unmistakably intentional. 3 people were dead. All of them connected to the high school where Ethan worked, a vice principal, a guidance counselor, and a part-time accountant. The house wasn't burning from a random fire, it had been set. And on a table near the bodies sat a typewritten note that read, "It's done. I couldn't let it continue." The note was signed, Ethan Rowe. When detectives arrived at Ethan's house that afternoon, they expected panic, denial, perhaps even violence. Instead, Ethan opened the door before they could knock. "I knew you'd come," he said softly. He was calm, polite even. He allowed them inside without resistance, offering them tea as they read his rights aloud. He wore a clean shirt, neatly ironed, and his hands were steady. When asked about the letter, he didn't deny writing it. He simply said, "You wouldn't understand unless you saw the tapes." Detectives exchanged uneasy looks. What tapes? None had been mentioned. But Ethan didn't elaborate. He repeated the phrase twice more during interrogation, "the tapes," then fell silent. Within 48 hours, he was charged with triple homicide. His fingerprints were on the typewriter used to compose the note, and traces of gasoline were found in his truck. It was enough for the prosecutor to call the case open and shut. The media dubbed him the janitor killer. The name stuck, splashed across every newspaper and local broadcast for weeks. But as the headlines raged, a quieter debate began to spread among those who knew him. Teachers, students, even parents, all said the same thing: Ethan was gentle, patient, almost pathologically kind. He fed stray cats behind the gym, fixed broken lockers without being asked, and brought coffee for the night shift. He never raised his voice, never seemed angry. So how did a man like that end up at the center of a crime so deliberate? Investigators struggled to find a motive. There was no evidence of conflict between Ethan and the victims. But there were anomalies. The accountant, Marissa Dean, had resigned abruptly 3 months earlier, citing personal reasons. The same Marissa Dean whose signature appeared on a set of falsified maintenance budgets, records that mysteriously vanished from the district's server shortly before the fire. Her name appeared again in an encrypted file recovered from Ethan's work computer. When police questioned her, Marissa denied any involvement. She claimed she hardly knew Ethan, that they'd exchanged only brief professional emails. Yet financial logs told a different story. She had transferred nearly $80,000 to an untraceable offshore account weeks before her resignation. When investigators confronted her with this, she refused further comment. For prosecutors, this was inconvenient but not disqualifying. They needed a clean narrative, and Ethan fit it perfectly. He had access to the school's systems, he had a connection to the victims, and most importantly, he wasn't talking. The trial began in late December. Millhaven's courthouse overflowed with reporters. Locals waited outside in the snow for hours, hoping to glimpse the man whose quiet life had erupted into infamy. Inside, the atmosphere was electric, grief and anger mingled with fascination. The prosecution painted Ethan as a cold perfectionist, obsessed with moral order, who discovered corruption within the school and decided to clean house. When presented with the note, Ethan didn't deny writing it. He simply watched, expression calm, eyes focused. One juror later recalled, he wasn't blank. He was detached, like someone observing rather than participating. For days, the prosecution built its case around motive and opportunity. They showed the jury maps, surveillance photos, timelines, all fitting neatly into a story of premeditation. But when the defense took its turn, the narrative began to fray. The gasoline traces, they argued, could have been transferred from Ethan's job site, where fuel was routinely handled. The typewriter? Common property of the school's English department, accessible to anyone. The supposed confession note, they claimed, could have been fabricated, the kind of detail a guilty party would never leave behind. Still, it was the smile that haunted everyone. Each day, Ethan sat in the same seat, motionless except for his hands. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his voice was steady, quiet, deliberate. But whenever emotional testimony filled the courtroom, when victims' relatives wept, or when gruesome details were recited, Ethan's lips would curl into that same faint smile. The media called it arrogance. The prosecutor called it proof of guilt. Psychologists called it disassociation. But no one could explain why, when the verdict was finally read, the smile deepened just slightly, almost like relief. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" the judge asked, his tone sharp, expectant. Ethan looked up, met his eyes, and said calmly, "You're looking at the wrong man." Reporters described the moment as eerie. Some jurors later admitted they felt something shift in the room when he spoke, a sudden doubt they couldn't shake. But the evidence was overwhelming, the pressure immense, and the verdict inevitable. Ethan Rowe was sentenced to life without parole. After the sentencing, he was escorted out of the courtroom through a side door. As he passed the cameras, his smile returned one last time, the kind of expression that wasn't joy, nor defiance, but quiet knowing. It lingered just long enough to become the final image of the broadcast, replayed endlessly on local TV. The anchor's closing line that evening captured the public mood. He smiled in court, even after what he'd done. To most, it was the end of a tragedy. To a few, it was the beginning of something much darker. When the trial ended, Millhaven exhaled. Reporters packed up their cameras, the courthouse emptied, and people tried to move on. But Detective Laura Briggs, who had spent 6 months on the case, couldn't. Something about it never sat right. The evidence had been too neat, too convenient, and the defendant too calm. She described it later as a story that wanted to be solved. Briggs returned to the case files 2 weeks after Ethan's sentencing. She read through transcripts, photos, statements, everything she could find. That's when she noticed the first inconsistency, a timestamp on a maintenance log, one that placed Ethan at the school at 7:42 p.m. the same night of the fire. The official timeline had him at the crime scene across town by 8 o'clock. The drive between the two took 35 minutes, impossible, unless someone had falsified one of the records. She dug deeper. The digital copy of the maintenance log had been edited, not once, but 3 times, and all by an unknown user account with administrator privileges. When she traced the IP address, it led to the school district's internal server. But the user didn't exist. Among the deleted data, Briggs found fragments of a folder titled Row_2. Inside were encrypted text files containing strings of numbers and short notes, almost like coded maintenance updates. One read, "Door B12 secured." They don't know what's behind it. There was no door B12 in the school's current layout. Curiosity became obsession. Briggs pulled the original blueprints from the town's archives. The annex had been remodeled 5 years earlier, after flooding damaged several lower rooms. One section, marked in red, had been permanently sealed, Basement B, Corridor 12. According to records, Ethan Rowe had worked overtime every night that week. When Briggs requested access to the sealed section, the district hesitated. They said it was unsafe, filled with mold and asbestos. She got a warrant anyway. With 2 officers, she pried open the rusted utility panel that had been welded shut and descended a narrow staircase. The air was cold, metallic, thick with the smell of stagnant water. At the bottom was a small concrete chamber, a forgotten maintenance room. Old cables hung from the ceiling like veins. Against one wall sat a desk covered in dust, with 3 monitors stacked haphazardly and a disconnected camera system still wired to the power grid. The drives were old, but intact. When technicians recovered the data, what they found changed everything. The footage spanned nearly 3 years, filmed from multiple angles across the school's basement corridors. Most clips showed nothing unusual: janitors, students, after-hours maintenance. But one sequence stood out. It showed Ethan Rowe walking through the basement, followed by another man wearing the same uniform. The resemblance was striking: same height, same build, same walk. The camera's grainy quality made it impossible to tell who was who. Even more disturbing was the audio, faint but audible under the hum of machinery. A voice, Ethan's voice, whispering, "They said I wouldn't remember." Briggs brought her findings to the prosecutor's office, but they refused to reopen the case. Unverified, they said. Inconclusive. When she pressed further, she was removed from the case entirely. That same week, a journalist named Noah Jensen began investigating the school's financial records. He discovered the same offshore accounts tied to the late accountant, Marissa Dean. The money trail led to a shell company registered under an alias, one linked to a government contractor specializing in behavioral research. Jensen published an article draft titled "The Millhaven Project." It disappeared less than an hour after uploading. His editor claimed a server error. 2 days later, Jensen was found unconscious in his car near the river. The cause was ruled an accident. Briggs went quiet after that. She resigned, citing burnout, but those who knew her said she'd started keeping notes, hundreds of pages of them. In one of the last entries recovered from her home years later, she wrote, "The smile wasn't arrogance. It was resignation." Ethan Rowe never filed an appeal. He spent 43 days in a county facility awaiting transfer to a state penitentiary. During that time, he refused visitors except one, Detective Briggs. Their meeting was recorded but never released in full. Only fragments of the transcript survived. "Why did you smile, Ethan?" In court, Briggs asked him. "Because it was over." "What was?" "The part one was supposed to play." "You mean your confession?" "No. The rehearsal." "Rehearsal for what?" "For being me." He smiled again then, small, weary, as if he pitied her. 3 days later, he vanished from prison custody. The official explanation was transfer to federal jurisdiction, though no record of that transfer existed. His cell was empty except for one object, a folded piece of paper tucked into the mattress seam. It contained a single phrase, "Tell them I remember." 2 years later, during a new wave of renovations at Millhaven High, workers uncovered a sealed door behind the boiler room. Faded white paint still marked the number, B12. Inside, they found a small room lined with outdated monitors and recording equipment. The chair in front of the screens was empty, dust-covered, except for a single sheet of paper taped to the wall. "You were right to look," it said in Ethan Rowe's handwriting. "But you're too late. The drives were missing. The cables were cut. And the room had been recently disturbed, dust cleared in strange patterns, footprints ending at the door." The school board ordered the annex sealed again within a week. Officially, the space no longer exists. Years later, the story of Ethan Rowe lingered like a rumor, a quiet ghost in Millhaven's history. Some said he'd been an experiment gone wrong, a subject in a psychological study no one dared to document. Others believed he had uncovered something hidden beneath the school, something worth killing to protect. But there was another theory, the one Detective Briggs wrote in her final note before she disappeared. Ethan Rowe was never one man. He smiled in court, and maybe he knew something no one else did. Whether he was a killer, a victim, or a copy of something darker, the truth about Ethan Rowe never surfaced. What remains is that smile, calm, unshaken, unforgettable, frozen in the last frame of his trial, the only clue left behind by a man who may never have existed at all.